Well, hello there, everyone. Welcome to Module 5. See some of you coming in here. That's great. We'll give it another minute or so to see if we have any more people hopping on. Good to see a familiar name back. So good to see you in here, Shane. I think you know the drill by now as we're going through the slide decks here. We're going to be going through the lecture series that we have. Again, throw in your questions into the chat. If it's just a few people in here, we'll try to get to those questions live. For this particular morning session that we have quite a few slides to get to. I think we have little over 40 slides in this particular deck. So we'll be moving relatively quickly through them because definitely want to leave some time for discussion here. Once again, my name's Alex Hoffman. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So let's go ahead and we'll get rolling with this morning's topics. And this morning's topics, we're going to be running through Chapter 7, which is Client Assessments, Chapter 8, which is the Elements of Fitness, and then Chapter 9, which is the Principles of Program Design. So the first 2 days, the first 4 lectures that you went to were a little bit more science intensive. And now we're going to be diving into the practical application. What are we actually doing with our clients? And the process of working with our clients is always going to begin with client assessments. So we can go ahead, click on over to our next slide here, and we can go ahead and read through what the learning objectives are for Chapter 7. Client assessments are really, really important because they are providing the roadmap, or they're providing all of the details for how we are going to build our roadmap. And our roadmap is our program design, right? To get our client to their ultimate outcome, their goal that they want to get to. But we can't fill in the details of that program design if we don't perform client assessments. Client assessments are going to inform us what skill level the client is. We're going to get insight into any injuries or health problems that the client may have that we need to be aware of so that we don't take on a liability that could potentially harm us as a personal trainer. Then we're also going to collect some hard data as well related to body composition and client performance and various exercises or metrics that we want to look at. And when we have those metrics, then not only does this give us a starting place, right, for our program design, but it also informs us with information as to when to go back and reassess clients periodically throughout their time of training with us, so that we can either determine if the client is progressing, if they aren't making progress at all, or if they're regressing. And if they're not making progress at all, or if they're regressing, that can indicate one of two things. One, that they're not adhering to the behavioral changes that we've set for them outside of the gym, or two, the program that they're engaged in isn't working for them in relation to their ultimate goal. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if that's the case. That just means we need to change up some of the variables of that program design. But we only know to do that, we only know how our client is progressing if we conduct assessments on our clients at the onset of the program and then conduct reassessments on the client periodically throughout their time of training with us. So the first assessments that we are always going to be gathering when working with clients is going to be their health and exercise history. So the health and exercise history assessments are something that you can find in the downloadable section of your ISSA CPT classroom. So if you log into your ISSA trainer account, you'll be able to click on the download sections there, and you will be able to see some of these health and exercise history forms that you can have a client fill out. And I think that's a really good resource. Obviously, you can create these on their own or use whatever the gym that you're employed at uses. But if you're on your own, there's no need to recreate the wheel. These are already there for you in that downloadable section of your course. And you'll notice with these assessments for health and exercise history, you're going to have some subjective assessments, which are opinion-based measures or assessments. So you're asking the client to rate themselves on various aspects of fitness, or rate how important certain goals are to them. And then you're going to also have objective assessments as well, which are measurable data that you can actually use, and that would come in relation to the client's health history. So are they or aren't they taking the medication? What's their height? What's their weight, et cetera? That's the type of measurable data that we can get from these health and exercise history forms. So you can see what some of these suggested assessment forms are. The important thing here is that you are collecting data. Or that you are conducting some assessments here for that exercise history, that you are getting a liability waiver completed, because that will protect you as the personal trainer, and that you are having a client fill out a PAR-Q form as well. So what that PAR-Q form will indicate is whether or not the client is ready to begin exercise. And if they answer yes to any of the questions that are on a PAR-Q form, you need to send that client to their physician, and they need to get physician clearance to exercise. So again, by doing that, by having the client fill out those forms, you're going to protect yourself as a personal trainer from potential liability should that client have an accident when they are working with you. The other thing that's really important from the health and exercise history forms here, as you're gathering these initial assessments, is this is also the time when you're going to be establishing what the client's goals are as well. So you can think back to the module 1 lecture that we had, where we talked about behavioral change and motivational interviewing. This is the time when you would be engaged in that with the client. So you want to get the client talking. You want the client to establish why they want to begin training with you. And from there, you want to work with your clients to develop SMART goals that they can work to achieve. And again, those are the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals for our clients. Once we collect the health and exercise history and do some goal establishment, from there, we're going to move into gathering body composition for our client. And so with body composition, regardless of what the client's goal is, these are important measurements to gather, because these are things that can be reassessed to determine if a client is progressing throughout the program. And so obviously within the textbook there's a chart where you can compare norms to based on sex, and then also client's age can play a factor in that as well. And when working with clients on their overall body fat percentage, again, we want to make sure that we're talking about that we're being realistic with the client as well, where they can get to in a predetermined amount of time. So typically a 1 to 2% loss of body fat in a month is really outstanding progress. So we don't want to be working with, or we don't want to set an expectation for a client that they, would be able to lose 5 or 6% body fat in a month, because that's not something that would be likely to happen. And then we can see here on the next slide the various body composition assessments that we can use. The important thing when choosing a body composition assessment is that when you are performing a body composition assessment on a client at their initial assessment, that you use that same body composition assessment with the client then on any sort of reassessments that you do. And you do that body composition assessment in the same environment as you did it at the initial assessment. So typically body composition assessments should be taken with the client in a fasted state. So that means that they haven't eaten for 3 or 4 hours, depending on the type of assessment that we're doing. But for most clients, they should be in a hydrated state at the time of the body composition assessment, but should have also just gone to the bathroom at that time as well. So they should have just urinated. And then typically we do not want to do body composition assessments when the body is heated. So it's not an ideal time to do body composition assessments after the client has been done training for the day. Ideally, these should be done before the client starts training with you, so that their skin is dry and so their body temperature is at a normal temperature there. The other thing to consider when using body composition assessments is we want to make sure that the assessment that we choose play or factors in a client's lean mass versus their fat mass. And so you can see a couple of assessments on here, such as the BMI assessment, which is the body mass index assessment. And that's simply a general measure of health status, and it can be used for a predictor of disease. But all you're getting is the client's height and weight information, and then performing a calculation based off of that. You're simply taking their weight in kilogram divided by their height in meters squared. And what that does is that gives you a number to determine based off of norms whether or not that client is of normal weight, underweight, overweight, or obese. This type of measurement doesn't take into account a client's actual fat mass or lean body mass. You could get someone who's very muscularly dense and maybe has a low body fat percentage, but because they're muscular dense, their weight would be a little bit higher, and they could be classified as obese based off of a body mass index. Same thing. So when we're conducting a body composition measurement, it's really important that at a minimum, we're starting or using circumference measurements. Ideally, we're at least using something like a skin fold measurement or a BIA measurement, which is a bioelectrical impedance measurement. And then those would be the two most common that we would use in a gym setting. And as long as we're repeating them in the same condition for the clients each time, those are going to be relatively accurate for us to use, so we can determine whether or not the client is making progress. And then air displacement plus plethysmography, hydrostatic weighing, and DEXA scanning. Those are typically things that are only done in a lab setting, at a university setting, or things that are done at maybe an Army wellness center as well. So typically you're not going to have access to those at gyms. Those are quite a bit more accurate than BIA or skin fold testing, but absolutely not necessary to be doing with clients as long as we're doing one of the other body composition assessments with them, and we're repeating those in the same condition there. Any questions on those before we start to get into some physical assessments for our clients? Tracking so far, I know this is stuff you are all familiar with. All right, so we'll go into some physical assessments here then. So when we're performing physical assessments, we'll be talking about them in the order of cardiorespiratory fitness assessments, maximal strength assessments, muscular endurance assessments, and then some postural assessments. Generally, what's important when we're assessing a client, that with each assessment that they're performing, they're relatively well rested. So it wouldn't be ideal to do a cardiorespiratory assessment for a client and then immediately follow that with a 1 repetition max or a maximal strength assessment, because you're not going to get a true maximal strength assessment measured if the client is in a tired state. So typically we want to do the assessments that require the least amount of energy first. So those would be our maximal strength assessments. And then we do our endurance assessments a little bit later on if we're doing all of our assessments in one day. When we're talking about cardiorespiratory assessments, again, we're just simply doing this to determine how well someone's heart, lungs, and muscles are performing during exercise. So these are going to be things that we'll mention on the next slide, but we don't need to click over right now. But things like a 12-minute run-walk test or a 1.5-mile run-walk test, etc. But before we conduct those cardiorespiratory fitness assessments, we want to make sure that we're getting our clients' resting heart rate, and we're also taking their blood pressure as well, or they've had their blood pressure taken and it's within a normative range prior to conducting that cardiorespiratory assessment. And the reason we want to have those measurements is, one, those are things that we can monitor to see if they're improving over the course of the time that the client is working with us. And then two, we want to make sure that the client is also healthy enough as well to perform those cardiorespiratory assessments. So we want to make sure that we're getting those basic measurements before we conduct one of the tests that we're now going to be talking about on our next slide here. So when we're testing cardiorespiratory or cardiovascular fitness, we can use one of the tests that are outlined in the textbook. All of these will be able to provide us with estimations of a client's VO2 max, which is simply the maximum amount of oxygen that the body can take in during exercise. And then we can compare those to norms based off of a client's sex and their age. And those norms are laid out within chapter 7 of your textbook there, based on the type of test that you conduct with the client. So we have the Cooper 12-minute run, which also could be done as a walk. And what you're doing with this is you're simply putting a client on a track, and you're going to record the distance that they complete in 12 minutes. And you can record that distance in either miles or kilometers. There's a formula in your textbook then where you can take that distance and estimate the client's VO2 max based off of their Cooper 12-minute run. Also, with the 12-minute run walk, if you don't want to do formulas and if you don't want to estimate a client's VO2 max, because that number may not mean much to a client, you can simply do this test as an initial assessment, right? And then do it again 4 weeks later, 8 weeks later, if improving cardiovascular fitness is a goal for a client, and you simply see, has the client gone farther in that 12-minute run than they did the first time that they did it with you? And if they have, they're improving. If they haven't, then we might need to change something up in the program there. Again, if improving cardiovascular fitness is the goal. So hopefully you're seeing how we can start to use some of these tests here. Then there's the 1.5-mile run. So that's exactly as it says, could also be done as a walk. You're simply having the client complete 1.5 miles as fast as they can. There's a Rockport 1-mile walk test. Again, very similar to the 1.5-mile run, having the client walk as fast as they can. And then you can estimate the VO2 max based off of that. Lastly, there's a step test, which is either a 5-minute assessment or a 3-minute assessment. If the client is elderly or deconditioned, you use a 12-inch step with this. You have the client step up and down on the box at a tempo of 96 beats per minute. You would use a metronome for this. And then you would measure their heart rate before and after, and you compare those results to the chart that's in your textbook to identify what their aerobic fitness level is. And with these, the best cardiovascular assessment to use is one that is safe for the client and is one that you feel comfortable with as a trainer and is repeatable for you. So next up, we assess the strength of it, or we'll discuss strength assessments here. When we're discussing strength assessments, we're discussing maximal strength assessments for a client. So typically we would use a leg press or a squat for lower body strength, maximal strength test. And then we would use a bench press for upper body maximal strength test. So when we're doing 1 repetition max testing, a true 1 repetition max, so we're seeing how much can a client only lift 1 time, that can be pretty dangerous for a novice or intermediate trainee. And so typically we would use a 5 or 10 rep max test, and then we would use the results of that 5 or 10 rep max test to estimate the 1 repetition max. And we can show you how to do that here on this next slide. So again, if we're working with a beginner trainee or an intermediate trainee, and we need to assess their maximal strength, what we would do is we would use a weight that the client can safely complete 6 to 10 repetitions of using ideal form. From there, we can estimate their 1 repetition max. And so we can see the steps to do that on this slide. The first thing we need to know is the number of reps that they've completed. We then take that number of reps, multiply that by 2.5. Once we have that number, we take 100 minus that number and divide it by 100. And that's going to give us an estimated 1 repetition max percentage. From there, We're going to take whatever that result is, and we're going to use the weight that was lifted for those 6 to 10 repetitions there. And we're going to take the weight that was lifted, divide it by that percentage, and then we're going to get the final estimated 1 RM. Sound confusing? Don't worry, we're going to go through a formula right now, or we're going to go through the process right now on this slide. So we have an example client here who is female, 34 years old, and weighs 142 pounds. That's going to be important information for step 3. The first piece that we need to know is that she bench pressed 65 pounds 6 times. So if we're following step 1 here, the first thing that we need to do is we need to gather what 65 times 2, we need to multiply 6 by 2.5. So we need to multiply the number of reps that she did and multiply that by 2.5. Is everybody seeing that in step 1 there? And when we take 6 and we multiply it by 2.5, we should be getting 15. And once we have that 15 number, then we can plug it into our equation. So we're going to take 100 minus 15. That will give us 85. And then we're going to get 85. And we are going to divide that by 100. When we divide 85 by 100, we get 0.85. So we know that 6 repetitions here is 85% of the client's 1 repetition max. So once we know that the weight that the client lifted was 85% of their 1 repetition max, we can then use that information to gather what the client's estimated 1 repetition max is. So this is pretty simple to do. So she bench pressed 65 pounds. So we're going to take 65 pounds and we're going to divide that by 85% or 0.85. And when we do that, we get this number on the slide of 76.47 pounds. Thus, this individual's estimated 1 repetition max is 76.47 pounds. Does that make sense how we did step 1 and step 2? Tracking along a little bit. It takes a little bit of practice there. And a little tip, if that sounds a little bit confusing to do those calculations there, know that there are online calculators that you can use. So I'm not a big math person, so I like to use online calculators. So I have a comment in here that says, I think I missed something. Where did the 65 pounds 6 times come from? That's our example right here. So that's the example that's on the slide. So when we did a test for the client in this sample right here, the client was able to perform 6 repetitions of a bench press safely with 65 pounds. And so then we're using that information then to estimate the client's 1 repetition max. And those are the numbers that we used in our calculations. And so again, that's just an example that we used. Does that make sense, Aaron? And then so when we have that information there, and we see that the client's estimated 1 repetition max is 76.47 pounds, we can simply take that estimated 1 repetition and we divided, and we just have them divide that by the client's body weight. And when we get that, then we get a comparable assessment value that we can determine on the next slide to see how that client compares to someone of their sex and age range. So then we can determine if the client is average, above average, excellent, etc. And Aaron, I like your comment here. It makes sense. I just don't know why I'd have the gut feeling to have them lift 65 pounds. That's a great comment there. So typically we would have a client do a warm-up set. This is also something that we would gather in their initial exercise and health history forms too. if they have been exercising before, right? Have they performed these exercises before? And it may be something that they haven't performed those exercises before at all. And so then we may not be using a standard free weight bench press to perform the exercise. Then we may put the client on a chest press machine where they're going to be a little bit safer. And then we can gradually just start increasing the weight until we get to a weight that a client is only able to do somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 times safely. And so that's how we would regress the assessment to make it a little bit safer for the client. If the client has exercised before, we could put them on a free weight bench press. But if they haven't, which is going to be the case for many clients, then we're going to put them in a machine where it's going to be a little bit safer. I'm glad that makes sense there. All right, clicking on over to the next slide, there's also a formula that we can use for lower body strength assessments and a chart that we can use to compare to as well for that. So we would perform one upper body max strength assessment, and then we would perform one lower body max strength assessment for a client. Lastly, we would finish out with our muscular endurance test for clients here. So muscular endurance test, I know that these are things that you would be relatively familiar with. The most common one is going to be the push-up test. When performing a muscular endurance test, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the client is using proper form on all of their repetitions. And so we don't want to count partial reps in an endurance test. And if a client is unable to do one repetition with proper form, then we're going to modify that test. So a modification of a push-up test would be having them perform push-ups from their knees. We also have posture tests that we can perform on clients. Posture tests can be formal or informal tests. What we're looking at with a posture test is how well a client is able to maintain or keep their kinetic chain intact during specific movement patterns that are there. So that could be in a static position, simply standing or sitting upright, or it could be when they're moving during a given exercise, such as a squat. And when we're talking about the kinetic chain, we're simply talking about how do our joints stack upon one another. So you can see an example of that here in this slide. The head should be sitting right on top of the neck, so it should not be leaning forward or should not be hyperextended back. The neck should be right over our shoulders, right? Shoulders should be over our hips should be over our knees. Our feet should be able to point forward when we're standing in a normal neutral position. They shouldn't be pointed outward or inward. And when we're doing that, we're stacking our joints on top of one another. And we're best able to keep our center of gravity in that position. So some postural deviations that we can identify when a client's standing just in a neutral position here as we click on over to that next slide. We may be able to determine if a client has lordosis, which is excessive inward curvature of the lumbar spine. So that could indicate that a client has weak abdominal muscles, tight hip flexors, and overactive erector spinae. We could see kyphosis, which is rounding of the shoulders. That's going to be the most common spinal deviation that you're going to see. That indicates tightness through the pectoral muscles, and then weakness or over and stretched muscles on the backside. Lastly, you'll see scoliosis occasionally. Scoliosis can indicate that there's some loss of bone density happening, and that's a sideways curvature of the spine. We can also do our postural assessments during a movement analysis as well. So we're simply identifying how well a client is able to keep form during a given exercise when that exercise is unloaded. So the example that we see in the textbook is a squat movement or an overhead squat movement. And we can use this to determine if certain muscles are overactive, which means that they're tight or shortened, and if other muscles are underactive. So for example, right here, if we're looking at this squat and the client's feet start to turn out, that could indicate that possible weak muscles during this would be the muscles of the calf, muscles of the hamstring, and then muscles of the inner thigh as well. And then some possible overactive muscles here during this particular exercise. If the feet are starting to turn outwards, right, would be muscles of the lateral calf muscles. So that would be the soleus there. And then also one of the three heads of the hamstring, and that would specifically be the biceps femoris there. That could be a little bit overactive. All of that information is laid out on pages 244 through 247 of your textbook. And that takes us through the assessments there. And so now we are going to go ahead and we'll move into chapter 8, which is elements of fitness. So with elements of fitness, again, we can read what the learning objectives are here for chapter 8. We're going to start with the components of fitness. And the components of fitness are simply what we just talked about during the assessments. So the components of fitness are going to be a client's cardiovascular endurance, their muscular strength, their muscular endurance, and then their body composition, and also their flexibility as well. And a client's flexibility plays into their postural assessment and their ability to perform movements in an unloaded fashion. So the components of fitness are typically things that we can improve through training, and we can use specific training protocols to target each of those components of fitness. So with our elements of fitness that we have, we'll go ahead, thank you, clicking on over to that next slide. So the elements of a fitness training program can impact the components of fitness that we have. So we can read what the elements of a fitness program are here on this slide. And it's dependent upon the client's goals, whether or not we include all of these elements of fitness into the client's training program. So the client's ultimate performance goal or outcome goal that they have is going to determine whether or not we incorporate an element of fitness in it. Their health is going to determine it, and then their overall needs as well, based off of those two factors, are going to determine whether or not we use specific elements in our program design that we have. There are a couple elements, though, that will always stay a part of a training program, regardless of what the client's goal, skill, or ability level is. And that's going to be the warm-up and the cool down. So let's go ahead and we'll start with the warm-up here. When we're talking about a warm-up is going to have two phases, and combined, a total warm-up is generally going to last about 10 to 15 minutes. There's going to be a general portion of a warm-up, which is going to last anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. And that's going to be a low intensity, non-specific activity. And we're simply using that activity to increase blood flow and body temperature. So that could be going for a brief jog, doing a brisk walk, hopping on a rowing machine, hopping on an elliptical machine, and doing it at a low to moderate pace to warm up our body temperature. From there, we would move into a specific warm-up, and a specific warm-up is simply either dynamic stretching or unweighted, unloaded exercises that mimic the loaded exercises we are going to be doing in that training session. So a specific warm-up are simply movements to prepare the body for the exercise or the sport that we're going to be performing that day. And this specific warm-up component is going to last anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes as well, which is going to give us a 10 to 15 minute range for our warm-up that we have. Again, with the goal of raising body temperature, increasing blood flow, warming our range of motion so that we are prepared for the exercise then that we are going to perform. A warm-up can include some flexibility training, which is our next element of fitness that we're going to be discussing. Notice that if we're going to be focused on flexibility in the warm-up, typically the type of stretching that we're going to be performing is dynamic stretching, which is simply movement-based active stretching that engages a muscle, right? So we're simply moving a muscle through its range of motion, but we're not holding it in at an end range of motion there. So it's not a static posture. This is something where we're simply moving a joint through its full range of motion, but it's a continuous movement that we're doing. That would be dynamic stretching. Static stretching, which is when we're lengthening the muscle and we're holding it in that lengthened position. So we, do a hamstring stretch where we're touching our toes and we hold that for 30 seconds. That would be our static stretching there. That's stretching that we would do at the conclusion of exercise. So dynamic stretching encourages improved or increased force production following it, while static stretching will temporarily reduce the force production capabilities of a muscle for about anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes after doing that static stretch. So static stretching is not ideal during a warm-up. We also have PNF stretching, which is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Again, this is typically something that would be performed in the cool down of an exercise. That's simply stretching where we activate a muscle by either pressing it against a wall or a partner for about 6 to 10 seconds. And then we move into a static stretch with that muscle for anywhere between 30 to 60 seconds. What that does, that brief activation of the muscle will desensitize our Golgi tendon organ, which is going to allow us to get a little bit deeper stretch of that muscle. Lastly, we have myofascial release, which is simply foam rolling or rolling our muscles over a tennis ball or a golf ball. And what that does is that breaks up the scar tissue of our muscle. This can be done during a warm-up or a cool down. Our next element of fitness that we have here is core training. So when we're discussing core training, we're simply referring to training that activates our abdominal muscles, adductors, glutes, spinal erectors, and pelvic floor muscles. So all of the muscles around our midsection here. Exercises that target the core can be body weight or loaded. And when we're doing core training, this is something that can be done shortly after the warm-up to activate our muscles to activate the muscles of our core before we do heavier lifts, or it can be exercises that we do at the end of our program for the day once we're already fatigued. Core exercises in general tend to be relatively safe, and we can use them for muscle activation purposes, or we can use them at the end of a program when we're already fatigued. Again, as with a warm-up and cool down, typically we want to incorporate some sort of core training into a program regardless of what the client's goal is, because a strong core is important for all other elements of fitness and typically translates to most goals that we have. Balance training is the ability of the body to remain upright and steady. So when we're doing balance training, we can use unstable surfaces. We can stand on one foot. We can use Bosu balls, balance pads, wobble boards, etc. We can do this to make an exercise harder or more challenging. We can also do this to improve the coordination of our clients. Typically, when we're doing exercises that require or that are focused on balance, we're going to be using a lighter weight or no weight at all. So this should be used when it's really specific to a client's goal that's there. Reactive training is going to refer to our SAQ training and then also plyometric training as well. So SAQ stands for speed, agility, and quickness. All of those are elements of our ability to react quickly and agilely and fast at a given time. So speed is the ability to move the body in one direction as fast as possible, generally front to back. Then agility is our ability to accelerate, decelerate, and change directions, which is closely related to quickness. And quickness is the ability to be agile fast, right? So it's the ability to change our body position with max force rate of production. Plyometrics training can improve our abilities in speed, agility, and quickness. So when we're talking about plyometric training, lower body plyometric training would be things like hopping, jumping, whether onto boxes or not. And then upper body plyometrics would be things that we would do typically with a medicine ball, throwing objects there, or occasionally things like exercises where we project our body into the air using our upper body force. So things like a jump push-up or a clap push-up would also be considered upper body plyometrics. Resistance training. Resistance training is something that we can use to improve strength, maximal strength. We can use it to improve strength endurance. We can use it to improve muscle size, and we can also use it to improve muscle power. Resistance training can be done with tools such as machine weights, barbells, dumbbells, medicine balls, or it can be done with body weight as well. Cardiorespiratory training, we've already discussed this a little bit during our assessments here. This is going to impact how the body delivers oxygen to our body tissues. Typically, when we're talking about cardiorespiratory training, we'll use 4 key metrics, which are listed on this slide, to determine what intensity we should be training at or how the body is going to adapt to that cardiorespiratory exercise that we're doing. So we have target heart rate, which is simply an estimated beat per minute that we would try to maintain exercise at to reach a specific exercise intensity, which hopefully would lead to a specific adaptation. That would be tied to our heart rate zones, which is the third item that we see listed on this slide, which is the percent of our max heart rate that's going to be associated. So that's a target heart rate that's associated with a specific physiological adaptation. So typically when we're working at 50 to 65% of our heart rate max, that's going to be something that we would do when we're in a warm-up. When we get to 60 to 75% of our heart rate max, that's something that we're going to be doing to improve our aerobic base. So we can do that for a long distance. And then if we start to get above 85% to 90%, that's when we're looking at improving our anaerobic endurance or improving our lactic threshold that we have. So those would be some of the different zones that we could train at using our target heart rate and then heart rate zones. We would simply be able to get our heart rate max, our estimated heart rate max from there by taking 220 minus our age. So if you're 40 years old, you would take 220 minus 40, your estimated heart rate max. That's the estimated maximal heart rate that you can train at, would be 180 beats per minute. And then if we want to train at a target heart rate of 75%, we would just simply take 75% and multiply that by our estimated heart rate max. That's there to get 75% for our target heart rate. So that's how we can use those pieces of information. Typically, when training clients, though, the easiest way to estimate how hard they are working during cardio exercise is simply to use a rate of perceived exertion. The scale that we would typically use is the Borg scale, which measures 6 as the very lightest that someone is working and 20 as the very hardest maximal effort that a client is giving. The reason we can use a Borg scale is because that can be correlated to a client's heart rate then at that time by simply multiplying whatever they rate their perceived exertion at by 10. So if they feel that something is very light, super easy, the easiest it can be, they rate that at a 6. That means that their heart rate should be at about 60 beats per minute because we simply take 6 times 10 and we get 60, right? If they say that something is somewhat hard, they would say that they rate it at a 10 or an 11. So we take 10 or 11 times 10 and we get 100 or 110. That would be about what their heart rate would be at that time. So that's how the rate of perceived exertion scale works. The last element of fitness that we have or a training program is going to be the cool down here. Cool down should be a part of every session that we use. And what purpose of a cool down is we can use that to improve and work on flexibility training for a client. So we'd be stretching during that time. When we're doing that, the body is then actively recovering and preparing for its next training session, whether 1, 2, or 3 days away. And then it's also helping the body to return back to its normal baseline levels of breathing and blood pressure as well, which is important for safety considerations. All right, in these last 15 minutes here, we'll go ahead and we'll cover the principles of program design. Know that the principles of program design is also something that you're going to be discussing with me tomorrow morning again. So if we go through these a little bit quickly, fear not, we're going to be right back with them tomorrow morning and discussing them in a little bit greater detail at that time. So chapter 9 is the principles of our program design here. We can see what the learning objectives are for that specific chapter. And when we're talking about the principles of program design, the first thing that we're going to be talking about are the acute training variables of program design. And the acute training variables of program design, as we click on over to that next slide there, are training variables that we can manipulate in every session, training session that's there, or we can manipulate them from exercise to exercise. So we'll go ahead and we'll talk about what each of these acute training variables are, meaning one time we can change these often, right? Depending on what our goals are and how the client is feeling that day. So we have the type of exercise that obviously just refers to whatever exercise, the equipment that we're using for that exercise. So we could be using type, whether it's cables, dumbbells, barbells, treadmill, etc. So type is referring to the equipment that's being used. Exercise selection then is simply referring to the exercise that we're performing, right? So are we performing a single joint movement, a compound movement? Exercises should always be matched to the training goal for the client, their abilities, and then also safety considerations as well. Exercise order is the order that we do our exercises in. So typically we're going to be doing our larger compound exercises first, and then we're doing our single joint or isolation exercises secondly. The reason for this is compound movements take greater neuromuscular coordination, and so we want to be doing this when we're fresh. Intensity is the amount of force that can be given in be produced in a given exercise or movement that we're doing. So when we're measuring intensity, when we're doing that for resistance exercise, that's going to be percent of 1 repetition max. When we're doing it for cardiovascular exercise, that's going to be percent of heart rate max or rate of perceived exertion. Sets is the total number of times that the exercise is completed. Repetitions is the number of times that a movement is completed within a given set. These are things I think you know. Frequency is the number of times a training session is completed in a specific period of time. So you could be training 3 times a week, 20 times a month, etc. Range of motion that we have is the movement of a joint or body part, or is the movement around a joint or body part, right? So full range of motion is going to promote the entire muscle to fire. Because we are moving our joint throughout its entire movement pattern that it has. It's interesting to note, right, that muscles only get stronger in the range of motion that we work out in. So if we're using partial repetitions, or we're only moving through a short range of motion, that means that the muscle is only getting stronger through the specific movement pattern that the muscle is working in. So if we want to get stronger throughout the joint's entire movement pattern, we need to make sure that we're using the complete range of motion with our exercises. Time refers to the duration of the activity, right? Tempo is simply the speed at which the movement is completed. And then time under tension is going to be the amount of time that a muscle is engaged during a set. Oftentimes, tempo is going to dictate how much time under tension the muscle is. And then we have rest here as our last one. So that's going to be the amount of time in between sets of exercise. And we can manipulate all of these acute training variables to elicit specific training goals. that we have. So as we go ahead and click on over to the next slide here, this is something that we'll go over tomorrow as well, as to which specific set, rep, intensity, and tempo ranges correlate to specific performance outputs that are there. But if we want to get our muscles bigger, we need to train at an intensity and volume that promotes muscle growth, which is muscle hypertrophy. If we want to improve our ability to produce maximal force, we need to work out in a range that promotes optimal strength, right? And if we want to gain endurance, we need to work out in the range that promotes optimal endurance. So we'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow in greater detail here as we're getting short on time. The 5 R's refers to acute training variables that can be manipulated to elicit a specific adaptation for a client. The 5 R's, it's a nice reference point, but know that it's not an exhaustive list, right? We just saw the exhaustive list of acute training variables that can be manipulated to elicit specific adaptations. The 5 R's refers to 5 of them. So range of motion, resistance, repetitions, rest, and then recovery. So recovery is slightly different from rest. Rest is referring to how much time we're taking in between sets of exercise. Recovery is referring to how much time we are taking in between bouts of exercise or in between training a specific muscle group, right? So we know that typically after resistance training, our muscles need about 42 to 72 hours to recover. So if we train our biceps on Monday, they're not going to be recovered and ready to train again until a minimum of Wednesday. That's 48 hours later. When referring to our acute training variables and the variables to manipulate when conducting a cardiovascular training session, we have the FIT principle here. So F stands for frequency. Again, how often is that training being completed? I obviously stands for intensity. So rate of perceived exertion or percent of heart rate max. Type refers to the mode that we're using. So are you on a treadmill? Are you on a track? Are you on a hill, etc.? And then time is simply referring to how long the cardiovascular activity is taking place. So are you exercising for 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, etc.? So when we have our FIT principle, we're taking frequency, intensity, time, or type, and time. And if we focus on designing our cardiovascular programs around manipulating those variables, we'll probably get some good results there for our client. Our principles of fitness here, these are also things that we're going to go over tomorrow. So I highly encourage, before we go into tomorrow's session, to read through what some of the principles of fitness are. Principles of specificity and the SAID principle are pretty similar to one another. That's just saying that the body is only going to adapt to the specific exercises and demands that we impose on it. So if we want to get a specific outcome, we need to train in a manner that promotes that specific adaptation, right? Principle of individual differences is simply stating that every single individual adapts differently, slightly differently to exercise. So we need to be prepared to customize our program based off of how that client's adapting. So those are a few of the key principles that we have. Again, we'll be going over these tomorrow again as well. Last few slides that we have here, one that we'll spend a little bit of time on is periodization. So periodization is simply the planned manipulation, right, of the training variables, those acute training variables that we discussed, in order to maximize training adaptation. So we want to prevent plateaus and then also to prevent overtraining as well. So the body typically adapts to a given training stimulus anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks. So after a 4 to 8 week period, we need to start to put some variance into our training program. Periodization helps us do that by breaking our training up into cycles. So typically the first or The major cycle that we have is the macro cycle, and that's going to refer to the entire duration of the program that's there. So if a client's going to be working out with you for 1 year, that 1 year then is the macro cycle that they are training with you. Because we know that the body adapts to specific stimuli after about 4 to 8 weeks, we then break that macro cycle down into various mesocycles. So mesocycles are simply short-term training goals that we have that typically last anywhere between 1 to 3 months, right? That lead to our overall final outcome goal that we want. So potentially when we're training a client, say a client is a beginning client that comes in working with us, they haven't trained before previously, they sign up and they're going to be training with us for a year. They have a goal of losing 15% body fat within that first year that they work with you. The first 1 to 2 months of that training program that they work with you may simply be placed on learning basic exercise and movement patterns that are there. The next 2-month period that we have with a client may be building up their aerobic endurance. The next training 2-month period that we have with the client may be focused on building up some strength through those movement patterns that they learned earlier on. And then that final 2, 3, 4-month period there, we can start to increase the training intensity for that client then at that time to further stimulate fat loss. And so that's how we can progress someone through a periodized training program. Within those mesocycles that we have that are the shorter training goals, we have microcycles. Microcycles are simply referring to a 1-week training period that we have with the client. So typically 4 to 8 microcycles make up one mesocycle for us. And then depending on how long the client is training with us, anywhere between 2 to 6 mesocycles may make up a macrocycle for a client. The next slide that we have is programming with periodization. So here you can see a few of the things that I just outlined, right? Periodization always starts simple and then progresses to a little bit more dynamic for clients, especially when we're talking about general clients that we have. Sport periodization is a little bit different because then we're talking about peaking athlete performance at a given time for a specific competition, but that's a separate topic. When we're talking about periodization for general population clients, we're always progressing them from simple to more difficult as that training program progresses. And again, the other thing that periodization will help with is preventing overtraining. So overtraining is simply the accumulation of stress that's going to result in performance decreases. And so overtraining is typically preceded by doing a stimulus at too high of intensity for too long. And that can really be different for each individual. And so we always want to monitor how our clients are recovering after bouts of exercises with us. And we only do that by tracking. So if we want to prevent overtraining, one, we want to make sure that we're changing up the stimulus for our clients and going through periods of high intensity and low intensity for them. We want to make sure that the exercises that we choose are conducive to a client's overall goals. And then we also want to make sure that we are tracking how our clients are feeling as well. So we as the client or as the personal trainer should be documenting every training session that we do with the client. And then we should also be asking the clients questions about how they're feeling every time that they come in to work out with us. And we should be documenting that as well. All right, last slide that we have here. We're going to make it through in this hour. Training categories that we have. We already talked about some of these a little bit. We talked about foundational training, which is training that we're going to be using to prepare our clients for more intense training. So during this period, we might be working on all of the elements of fitness, and that's going to include flexibility, core, balance training, also improving a little bit of aerobic capacity as well during that time. Strength training is obviously referring to resistance training there. Metabolic training is going to be high intensity aerobic or anaerobic training that we're doing to make our metabolic system and a cardiorespiratory system a little bit more efficient. So this can include things like interval training and HIIT training. Speed, agility, quickness training. We talked about that already. That can include things like ladder drills, can include things like cone drills, sprint drills, change of direction drills, etc. And then lastly here, I think looks like we made it through it all. And so speed, agility, quickness training also can also incorporate plyometric training into that, which is jump training or hopping, or again, any sort of upper body push movement that may project us into the air, or throwing medicine balls, slamming medicine balls, etc. would all be plyometric training as well. So you got 1 minute of bonus time with me today. Throw me a thumbs up in that chat room if we got all of the information covered satisfactorily. Know that tomorrow morning you're going to be back in with me. We're going to be rediscussing much of this material. We're going to be going into concepts of resistance training and then exercise selection and technique here. And then this afternoon, you are going to be discussing flexibility and cardiovascular training. So yes, this was a lot of information here. I agree with that statement there. That's information overload, right? Know that we're going to be breaking it down some more tomorrow, and you're also going to be breaking it down on the flexibility and cardiovascular training side this afternoon as well. So this is the tip of the iceberg, and we'll dive deeper into that iceberg throughout the next few lectures that we have. All right. Thank you for hanging with me this afternoon or this morning, and we'll see you all again tomorrow morning. If you're not able to attend the afternoon, that's okay. Know that those sessions are recorded and you can find those into your dashboards. I'll go over that with you tomorrow morning as to how to find those recordings in your dashboard. If they haven't put them in there for you yet, they typically take about 48 hours to get uploaded in there. So you should start to see those pop up in there today, those recordings. All right, everyone. We'll see you back tomorrow morning, and I hope some of you are able to make this afternoon's session. See you then.